Lesson 1, the Greek alphabet and you. You know, Catherine, when I was writing my beginning Latin book called Getting Started with Latin, I never had to worry about teaching them any alphabet because Latin uses the same alphabet that English uses, what we call the Latin alphabet, or sometimes in British books, you'll see it called the Roman alphabet. But when it comes to Greek, that's not really the case. They have to learn a whole new alphabet just to get started reading this language.
Yeah, there's almost a pre-learning step where before we can start learning words, the whole alphabet has to be learned. But the nice thing about the Greek alphabet is it does share some similarities with the Roman or the Latin alphabet. And so there are some advantages to being a descendant.
And since I'm a big fan of the alphabet, you know, I use it every day. I thought it would be fun to share the story here in Lesson 1 of how we got our alphabet that we use in English, and along the way to show them where the Greek alphabet came from, and so they can see how it's related to the Latin or Roman alphabet.
Yeah, and it is a fascinating story, and it touches a bunch of different countries, and it's almost as fascinating to figure out where the alphabet came from as it is to learn it.
That's right. So according to scholars, you know, we've had lots of archaeologists who have found inscriptions. We have lots of people who study ancient Egypt, people who study ancient early Hebrew inscriptions. All these scholars have figured out pretty much where our alphabets came from. And so it all starts way back in ancient Egypt, land of the pyramids. So the Egyptians, as I say here in the book, they used special symbols called hieroglyphs to write their language on the walls of their temples, tombs, monuments, etc. And it's important to note that there's a difference between a language and a script. So languages start out as spoken communication systems. They don't start out as written writings or inscriptions. They start out with just people talking to each other. And then later, people figure out ways to write that down. And so they need what we call a script or some kind of writing system to write down their language. And so the ancient Egyptians had hieroglyphs. And they also had another system called hieratic, and yet another even simpler system called demotic, which was kind of a shorthand or a cursive way to write hieroglyphs. And so on the map here in Lesson 1, you'll see the number 1 on Egypt. And so archaeologists found that some of these demotic markings had been used in the Sinai Peninsula, and that's where the number 2 is on the map. They had been used to write down a Semitic language.
Right.
They adapted some of these symbols to write down words in the Semitic language family. The Semitic language family includes languages like Phoenician, Hebrew, Akkadian, Arabic. So over time, those methods of writing Semitic words somehow moved north to Canaan and became a Semitic alphabet, or Abjad as we call it in a more technical sense. That's where number 3 is on the map. And then number 4 is an important step because that's the Phoenicians.
Yes.
And so the Phoenicians were sea traders. They would trade all over the Mediterranean. And so according to what we know, they took this Semitic alphabet with them all over the Mediterranean, and the Greeks ended up borrowing it from them.
And so as trade moves, so does the alphabet, and then it gets modified and shared and tweaked and all that, as things do when they move.
Right. And the Greek language is not in the Semitic language family. So you have the Greeks taking a Semitic alphabet and adopting it for a non-Semitic language, the Greek language.
So they'll have to change some things because some of the sounds are different. Some of the ways of representing them will have to be different as well.
Exactly. They had to change the sounds of a few characters. And there were some letters of the Semitic alphabet that were not exactly vowels, but they were used as sort of signals that a vowel sound ought to be there.
Mm.
And so some of those became actual vowels in the Greek alphabet. And then finally, these alphabets make their way west to the Etruscans and Romans, and they adapt it to become the Roman alphabet, which is the alphabet we use today for English.
So, Bill, in that, I want to kind of just highlight the fact that that means that the Roman alphabet or the Latin alphabet is kind of a descendant of the earliest version of the Greek alphabet. And so when we have these kind of crossovers that we're going to see later in the book, that would be only expected at this point, because if the Roman alphabet grows out of the Greek alphabet, we'd expect some similarities to remain.
Certainly, and especially in the uppercase forms, right? Because in the uppercase versions of Greek letters, a lot of them look exactly like Roman letters.
Yes, still.
After all these years.
Indeed.
So before we go, a quick story about Cadmus. In Greek mythology, there's a story that Cadmus, who was the king of Thebes, is the one who brought the Greek alphabet from the Phoenicians to the Greeks.
Right.
So we actually see that legend reflected in Greek literature. I believe it's in Herodotus, isn't it?
Yeah. And some of that crossover between what's myth and what's history is very fuzzy for the Greeks, as you know. And so that fact that you have this story about Cadmus that reflects what then scholars have reconstructed later does make sense.
Well, I just didn't want our listeners to myth out on anything.
Oh, definitely not.
So before we go on, one last point. The readers have got to learn the Greek alphabet if they want to read Greek.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to memorize what each letter looks like, and that can be tough for new students of Greek. I remember when I was learning Greek for the first time, it was quite a challenge at first to keep all the different letters straight and to remember what sounds they make. And so for that reason, in this book, I introduce each letter one letter at a time, and we go slowly so they can really absorb the letters and it's not too overwhelming for them.
Right. And that way there's a full absorption, particularly as we get to letters that are not reflected in the Latin alphabet. That'll be helpful.
That's right, Catherine. Some of the letters will look similar to letters they already know, and then other letters will not look similar or sound similar.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a bit of work ahead of us, but we'll take it real slowly and go through each letter one at a time.
Definitely.